all the stars are above me, and then out in front of me are the mountains of South Africa, and they're just incredible. Like, it's very mountainous here. It's quite dry, but oh, shoo. The dog is near me, but dogs are not so. I don't really play with dogs here.
Signifying Something with Steve Flato.
Hey everybody, this is Signifying Something. My name is Steve Flato, and I literally just got off Skype with Matthew Revert, and I am feeling raw, like really raw, because this guy is so in touch with something that I've been striving for a long time, which is to express myself in music. And he does it through books and scoring for films and even graphic design. And I just feel like, look, this show is not about asking the facts about a musician and being like, oh, where did you grow up? What was your first influence? What got you into experimental music? And we talk about that a bit, just the phrase experimental music, and I think we explore that a bit. Again, I don't want to get hung up on stuff like that, but I think it's interesting that we do touch on it, and I feel like that Matthew is a truly experimental musician. He's experimenting with his feelings and emotions and pushing himself in a way that is truly, in my mind, an experiment. And we get into that a little bit. And I think that's really resonates with me, because that's what I want to do. That's what I really want to do. And I'm coming at this podcast from a really subjective perspective. I'm a frustrated musician, and I've reached the end of my rope, and I want to talk to these people that I respect and find out what's happening in their heads. And that's the whole idea of signifying something. I feel really raw right now, and I want to thank Matthew for having this conversation with me. We get into the idea that music is kind of therapy sometimes, and this conversation was therapy for me in a lot of ways. Like it got me really in touch with what I want to do and how I feel about music and my approach to making things and why I've been afraid in the past and why overcoming fear is sometimes the most important thing to me with music. So me and Matthew get into it. We get a little deep. It's like a therapy session for me. This whole thing is a therapy session. And I'm going to talk to these more objective composers because I really love their music. And I wonder if some of them are expressing themselves through this objectivity too. I know that I have in the past. I've expressed my loneliness and disconnected feelings through making objective pieces. Anyway, I really hope you guys enjoy this conversation with Matthew Revert, and I hope that you guys have a better grasp on what I want this program to be. So, Matthew, good to speak with you for the first time, man.
Likewise, Steve. I mean, we've certainly chatted, but now I know what your voice sounds like, and I'm starting to use it to form this picture of you.
Yeah. So we've chatted a bit before, and there's I don't know, I found it absolutely, we had a great conversation before, when maybe a week and a half ago, and you said this one thing to me that I had to write down. You said, I'm not happy unless what I'm revealing makes me uncomfortable. Can you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, I guess for me, I don't see any point in doing something unless it's a form of communication with myself. And the only form of communication I really feel I will learn from when it comes to myself is that which is out of my comfort zone, something that really confronts me in some way. And I don't know if that ever carries across to whoever might be listening to it or reading it or however they may be,
I think it does.
Consuming it.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. That's good. I mean, hopefully, too, there's also enough ambiguity so they don't necessarily need to attach my own experience onto themselves, but they can put their own into it. That's also important for me, too.
So you touched on one subject there. In experimental music, generally, there's this focus on the objective rather than the subjective.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I feel that there's so much subjectivity in your music, and it's not this objective like experiment.
I kind of hate the term experimental music anyway. I've always distilled what I do down to the most basic description of I make songs. And that is the best way for me to approach it. I don't feel like I'm boxing myself in that way. And yeah, I'm not the sort of person who can engage with something unless I'm feeling deeply for it. And for me, it really has to be subjective because it's what makes me feel for it.
You've got this song form, but it's absolutely pushing something with me, both emotionally and in form. It makes me feel this sense of alienation. This piece specifically, borntwo, which we're going to play in a second, it gives me the sense of alienation. It gives me this sense of, it's like this hazy, plodding, worn out feeling. It's like something that you're looking back on.
I love that. I mean, I for a start, I love that it does make you feel something. But I was re-listening to that piece again before this interview just so I could have it fresh in my mind. And I remember very specifically what I was trying to do with that piece. And that was to go beyond the point of my own exhaustion and to reach a point where I had nothing left to say, and then to make sure I kept saying it anyway. Because what happened was that particular track is an alternate take of what is now the last track on my upcoming Kai record. And that last track's 5 minutes or so. And I just had an urge to see what would happen if I pushed that idea too far. And you can, I say you, but I know myself when I'm listening to it also because I remember the experience of making it. When it gets to the 15-minute mark, I mean, to me, I can hear the frustration in my voice because there's just nothing left to say and I'm still pushing myself to say things. And that was really interesting to me. I just, by the time it was over, I was so angry at it. and I loved that.
That you touched on something that I was curious about. Do you write out these words or are you improvising them or is it something in between?
I would say perhaps something in between. So I mean, with this upcoming record of which this track you're going to play is part of that world, nothing at all was pre-written. With my first record, that was half pre-written, half not. And that was also very deliberate because I'm also a novelist. I really massage the hell out of what I'm writing until it's as perfect as it can be. And that has its place and it's maybe better for the page, but I didn't see the point in being so rigid when it came to this music. The music itself, it's shambolic, it's dirty, it's bricolage. It didn't make sense for there to be this one finely polished component. So I would come into each piece with an idea of what I wanted to say and the general theme of the song. And then I would just force myself in that position and try as much as possible to use the first take so that I wasn't perfecting it.
So it's cool that there's a distinction between these very molded words that you've got in your novels and then this more intuitive approach to the songs. How do you connect vocals and words to the music that you're making? Like what is that experience like? And because there's such a connection here, like it really captures the feeling. The words sort of float by for me, like, and it really illustrates the feeling that is happening.
I think a lot of that actually comes down to the fact that none of it is pre-written. What I will typically do, I in these tracks in particular, I had an approach to making them where I would create some form of foundational track. And so on the piece you're going to play, you could look about that foundational track as maybe the synth lines and the harmonium. And so I would have that as a foundation. and I would record that, and then I'd play it back to myself, and then I'd use the feeling of that to sort of direct the words.
I feel like there is something experimental in that, because you've got, you're kind of testing yourself, first of all, by pushing yourself to the point of exhaustion. You're also testing the fact that you're improvising these words and feelings as you go. And I find that to be an experiment in a lot of ways.
You are right. And I am, in everything I do, there's some form of experiment. I just don't personally feel the need to demarcate what I'm doing by that experiment. And also my attachment, or lack thereof, with the term experimental music, it's more semiotic. I don't like what that term has come to signify. And for me, I have no doubt that people who listen to what I do, they will say that's experimental music, that's avant-garde, that's whatever they want to say, and that's completely fine. But if I start to use those terms myself, then I do worry that it's going to direct it in a certain way, and I don't want that. So it's more a tool for myself rather than telling anybody else, I am not experimental music.
That's great. I understand that, because I kind of don't consider myself to be an experimental musician either in the traditional sense. Like I'm taking things from experimental music, techniques, textures of it, and stuff like that. I'm really subjective about it. My whole goal is to illustrate what I'm going through at a specific time, my feeling, and sometimes that comes out sounding kind of cold, but that's because I'm feeling cold. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. Yeah. And I remember you and I actually talking briefly about this, and I think one thing that I believe you and I share in our approach is that in some ways we want to capture that feeling in what we're doing. So we can look back upon something we maybe did a couple of years ago and be able to rebuild that feeling and understand where we were. And something may sound cold because, as you said, you were feeling cold and distant. And it's interesting because that cold distance is so often associated with experimental music that somebody listening to that might not necessarily know that there's that personal connection. And I find that really interesting. And with what I do, I'd say most of it is uncomfortably intimate. If there's, I hope anyway, that people get a sense of intimacy from it. I guess that's usually my starting point. And I can, maybe explore any range of emotional responses from that starting point. And that's just kind of how I've been approaching it.
That uncomfortability, like that you were talking about, because I think that's a really good starting point. Because if you make yourself uncomfortable, you're kind of looking at fear. And I feel that fear is such an important part of the creative process. And getting past it, just not being afraid. I mean, I made music for 5 years without showing anybody in my mid-20s. Finally, I just said, fuck it. I think once I did that, I started kind of having more fun with it and kind of growing more because I would see people's reactions to it. Music is important to be heard by other people.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and I agree with that. I have a similar sort of evolution myself. In my late teens and early 20s, I was working a lot on music, and at the time I would have happily said I'm making experimental music, and I think my main drive wasn't to express anything that needed expressing, rather it was to hope that it passed the gatekeepers, whoever the gatekeepers were. But I just wanted to make music that fit in, and as a result, I made a lot of really shit recordings. Not shit in that you listen to them and go, oh, this is really poorly done.
Yeah.
Shit as in this could have been made by Experimental Music Bot 3000. It was just so bland and so uninteresting.
And is that really experimental? Is that,
That's exactly, and that's what I mean when I talk about the semiotic meaning of experimental music, because it's not experimental, but it fits so snugly into this definition that, the experiment aspect of experimental music means nothing. And that, to me, it's damaging.
I think we should let the listeners hear what we've based this first part of the conversation on. and then we'll come back and we'll discuss it more, and we'll go on to your upcoming releases and the film you scored, Cat Sick Blues. Let's get to the piece.
For all you know, you weren't supposed to be here today. For all you know, you walked down the wrong street and found nothing but incorrect patterns, and the backgrounds didn't sing or any conversation at all, really. There was nothing but you and your mistake. Have a family. You have people who claim they depend on you. And when you look them in the eyes, what do you see? Do you just see versions of yourself responding to you? You need to understand something. They still exist when you leave the room. see what it means not to exist in their life. And understand that it didn't even matter. Sometimes when I the words are there, I can feel them. I'm not sure I believe in words that are capable of changing another's mind. I'm not sure I believe in words that can influence opinion. I used to think that perhaps a sequence of words existed, if used in the exact right order, the exact right cadence, timbre, they would inspire something, I don't know, change, backing away from a long-held opinion. You're lucky to have the people that you have, you know. You're lucky that when you talk, they talk back, you know. You're lucky that they're willing to share the same space, you know. You're lucky that your words enter them and stay there for a while. You're lucky that when you sleep, there's nothing there to get you. So involved in something different, that you didn't understand the importance of all of your sayings. I was told to get angry for my uncle. I was told to let it keep going. Maybe I'll reach a point that is so far beyond orchestration. Right, yeah. I think it's in that moment when you have no ideas left that real ideas come. So many stories about the meals you've prepared. I guess I get easily jealous when I consider what I have. Maybe that's a very important part of being what you are. Found myself in this place that's beyond my idea. I had a reason. The longer I kept going, the less my reason meant. And I can't help but think that this is what you really need to hear. That it's these words now at the end of wherever I've been. Don't give up. You won't, but don't. My God, I keep thinking about the throwaway words we say in the height of an emotional moment. Things that have such ramifications, I suppose, but we say with such flippancy. You're not going to hurt yourself. You're not going to hurt anyone around you. You're not going to run away. You're not going to find something new. It's not the way that it happened. It's not. I've been too utterly devoid of that. Alright. You've had your moment. It's time to settle on back. You'll have more moments. It's okay, don't worry. This wasn't your only. Yeah, this wasn't your only. Nobody said you've just got this one moment to fly away. Be a different person inside. I mean, you know. That's not what you are. It's not what anyone. I just can't. If I were to suggest one thing, every morsel of advice to tell yourself, ignore it. Treat that advice as though it came from the most contemptible person you've ever met. Do the adverse opposite, perhaps. Don't you sit in. What have we discovered here today? I can't forget everything I said. Currently thinking about people who I care about and the times I've seen them lost in some way. I don't know, I think that after a certain amount of time, what occurs is an understanding of the pattern. It can seem random. Guess that I am seeing less point than ever in expecting the mouth of your ears to chew the ears of my mouth. Something that's it would all be so random were it not so specific. It would all be so random were it not specific. I'm exhausted. Absolutely. Spend like pocket money. Video game. It's gotta be where it all stops. It's gotta be so
All right, we are back, and that was borntwo, which is an alternate version of the track Born on Matthew's Kai LP. So, Matthew, how do you get in the mind state to record something like that?
I have once again, a very specific approach to that. I don't try to get in a specific mindset to record songs. I record songs if I find myself in a specific mindset. And I think that's an important distinction. Rather than, I'd really hate the idea of forcing something emotional. I don't want to make it performative in that way. So it's if I'm inspired to do it, it's because of what I'm already feeling. So it's a lot easier for me to really dial in on that feeling and stay there.
That really hones in on the therapy aspect of your music. You're exploring what you're feeling. You're not forcing some sort of fake performative thing. It's just exploring exactly what you're going through at that moment.
Yeah, and also a very conscious decision not to be embarrassed by doing hackneyed things. Like, I feel that little tricks like drenching your voice in reverb, I mean, that's become so hackneyed that, you know, a lot of people just don't do it. And in the past, I'd think about such things, but when I was doing this, I was like, no, fuck it, I'm going to risk being embarrassing. I don't care. Here's reverb. I'm putting it on my voice. Deal with it. and I also like doing that because it was that in its own was a form of discomfort that I know that I'd struggled with in the past and stopped myself from doing certain things purely because I was worried what other people would make of it. And I wanted to push beyond that. So yeah, I just did it and I don't regret it.
That's great. I mean, we were going right back to the fear and uncomfortable feeling thing. And I think that that's a key thing. My whole thing is to work through my anxiety and depression with music. Because that's what like kind of runs my life in a lot of ways. And music is the cure for me. So I totally relate to the idea that you're exploring your actual mind state in that moment. That kind of connects to your No Rent tape. Because you told me that you recorded this during having the flu, right?
Yeah, I did. I remember it because it was during the last Olympics. So that was late last year. I'm trying to remember. I can't even remember where they were now. Brazil or something. But anyway, that's all by the by. I was quite unwell, so I had to take a few days off work and I was just on the couch and found myself just watching the Olympics and just having like feverish episodes and just thinking to myself, it would be such a shame to waste this illness. So I literally dragged a few bits and pieces to my sick couch and I recorded and played it all while lying down. And so I attempted to capture that illness. And when I listen back to it, to me, it does, I mean, I can sort of sense fever and disorientation and confusion, and I think that for me at least it definitely does remind me of how horrible I felt during that. And it was also really interesting too because that was much more carefully constructed than the Kai record. Those Kai records are basically what I recorded is what came out the other end and what people are going to hear. With the No Rent tape, I recorded raw material and then I would go in and quite carefully construct that into the pieces. But I wanted to try to, it was a race against my own illness because I wanted to do all of that before I started to get well. So that was an interesting couple of weeks, but I think it came out okay, and I did manage to get it all done before I started feeling better, so that was good.
You used whatever tools that you used. I don't want to get into your technique because I think that's kind of gear talk and I don't really want to focus on gear talk on this show, but whatever you were doing technically, you managed to capture the feeling. And I think that's the most important thing that's like the unifying thing that I see in your music. And you were saying that before, just like this capturing the subjective experience, being a photographer, putting it in your photo book. Do you think there's like a unifying thing between your books, your music?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like with the music I do, I can't write a book unless I am extremely personally, emotionally invested in it. It's really the number one criteria I need to meet in order to even start something. And it's interesting talking about this No Rent tape and me recording it whilst I was unwell, because my second book, The Tumours Made Me Interesting, that actually, I started writing that because I thought I had bowel cancer. It turned out to be Crohn's disease, which is not great in and of itself, but it wasn't bowel cancer. But during the first half of that book, I still hadn't been diagnosed with Crohn's, and I was getting sicker and sicker and sicker, and possibly the most unwell I've ever been in my adult life. And so it became a means of me to explore my own mortality. And I guess I got kind of melodramatic in my own mind, as people are wont to do, and I just thought, oh my God, I'm going to die. I better do something with that. So I started writing this book that was from somebody convinced they were going to die. So I really poured that into it, and then at about the halfway mark, I found out that it was Crohn's disease. I'm not sure actually how that changed the nature of the book, but I'm sure it must have, because I was writing so directly to what was going on around me at the time that it had to have. But yes, I've always been like that. I need to have this really strong personal connection with what I'm doing. Otherwise, I just can't bring myself to do it.
That's really interesting, because I feel like for the first 4 or 5 things I released, I was exploring cold and distant, because that's how I felt. I was not in touch with my emotions at all. And then since October, I broke up with my girlfriend of 5 years. And since then, there's just been a lot of growth, and I've gotten in touch with my feelings again. It's really strange. So it's changed my music. It's changed my state of mind. I'm not cold and distant. I felt so much from that I had to get in touch with it. I think there's some sort of similarity there, but I expressed it in this really distant way. And it's all about capturing how you feel for me, and I'm guessing for you. And, I think that going back to you said you were being melodramatic, I think that's sort of the same thing as putting reverb on your voice and not being afraid of it. Even the fact that you use melody in your music, so strongly, and rhythm, there's a pulse to the piece we heard, there's melody in it. Being melodramatic is important sometimes because that's how you feel.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel like it goes back to that fear thing, and not kind of giving a shit what people think of you. That's the main thing that I've been through since October, when I broke up with my girlfriend, is I don't give a shit anymore.
And yeah, because what is the point in giving a shit? It really, what we do is already so marginal that why would we just keep paring that down to thinner and thinner slithers? I mean, what are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to satisfy? So I feel very lucky that I have avenues in which I can do pretty much exactly what I want. And while I have those avenues, I'm going to use them, and I'm not going to... I think it is something powerful about willing to be disliked or hated.
Yeah.
To put something out there and think, you know what? It's okay if you hate this. I saw a hilarious review of my first record, and I think it ties into the confusion that I create by putting things like melody in songs that I do. With Not You, my first record on Kai, there's some really overtly melodic guitar lines on that, and it led to some reviewers calling me a singer-songwriter, which I thought was pretty hilarious.
Yeah.
And so they would write that I was a singer-songwriter and start trying to sort of stitch me into the folk tradition. And,
box you in,
yeah. Yeah, I thought it was kind of hilarious. And I saw just a little user review on, it was like Discogs or Rate My Music or something like that. And this person had written, I purchased this record because I was told it sounded like more recent Sun Kill Moon. Don't make the same mistake I did. And that utterly elated me. I just thought that was the funniest thing. And I lie. I mean, I don't deliberately set out to create this sort of confusion, but if it just happens, I'm going to celebrate it.
Absolutely. And that's the problem with saying, oh, this is folk music. Even if I I was writing a write-up for your music before, and that word went in my head. I was like, it's like exploded folk music. Just fuck that, because if you say that you are something, you box yourself in, and I'm learning that more and more. I'm learning that from this conversation. I am really glad that I haven't used the word experimental music in this show, defining what it is. I did this little intro podcast, and I said, I'm using the term experimental music very vaguely to describe this stuff. I'm glad that I kind of deleted that and it's gone. You're totally right. That creates these lines, and it's not like that. It's amorphous. You could do anything you want to.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you're exploring melody and rhythm and not afraid to use it. It's I don't know. I don't give a shit anymore, and I think that it's a good thing for an artist to kind of not give a shit and let people hate them if that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, for me, I like that freedom I have where if I wanted to, the next thing I record could be a polka record if I wanted to, or anything. And that wouldn't be out of step because I never bothered putting myself in step in the first place. And it should be noted once again, this is just the more recent iteration of me. That late teens, early 20s version of me can fuck off, because he really was all of the things that I now actively rail against. Which I would hope so. I'd hope for most people they would rail against their earlier selves. But it felt nice because I started writing because the whole music thing was ridiculous. I wasn't doing anything worthwhile, and it just seemed like a waste of my time. So I started writing, and it felt like I had more genuine expression in writing, and I started recording music again because I got writer's block, and that's the music that actually started to connect with people. So it's interesting how a blockage in one medium can open, another medium.
That's so cool, because I really thought you started as a writer. That's something that I just had no idea about. Because, that's how I first knew you, as this author. And then you put out Not You. That was your first record. And I said, oh, shit, Matthew's doing music. And I didn't realize that was your starting point. Your starting point was music. And I totally relate, because when I was in my late teens and early to mid 20s, honestly, until last October, really, I gave so much of a shit. The people I respected, I wanted their approval. And I don't think I've really done anything yet that has proven that I've moved past that necessarily, but I feel it, and I have this drive in me now to do it. What was the moment where you kind of had that change of heart?
But when it comes to music, for me, it was because for the first time I was making music without the intention of having anybody hear it. When I was working on the music I was doing in my early 20s, it was always with this hope that, I want to get on this CDR label or be on this digital compilation or something like that. Little stepping stones that in the greater scheme meant nothing, but that at the time felt important. So I was always making music with the idea, will this label like it, And when it came to the material that would become Not You, that was simply me with a 4-track, a chair, a microphone, and just putting in a cassette tape and just recording for the hell of it and really enjoying it and finding that what I made, it intrigued me, and partly because it was so, I guess, superficially unlikable, but beyond that, there was something that really... It had me in it for the first time, I think. And so I would just keep recording tracks like that. And I think by the end of it, the 10 tracks on the album are part of some 25 tracks I actually recorded. Yeah, that just came about because I had been doing design work for Graham Lampkin, and we were talking quite a lot. And yeah, the topic of music came up, and I mentioned that I'd been doing this stuff. He was interested in hearing it, and he was really interested by it, and also instrumental in the way that the whole record was shaped. And that started it for me. It was really quite amazing.
That's super organic, and just like, I love that you said it was the first thing that had you in it.
Exactly. It was not you, it was me.
That's so great. I had no idea that was the connection to it. That's such a great title. I really appreciate that now. Man, I feel like I have gained more from this conversation than I did in 4 years of music school. Like, as far as as far as making things, like, yeah, you really have this grasp on something similar that I'm going for, and like that I've strived for. I don't think I've done it yet. And I think it's a combination of what you just said, not trying to be like, man, I want this CDR label to release my music. What are they going to like? It's more an expression. That's how it should be for artists that want to explore that deeply. Other people do not. And like, I love artists like Alvin Lucier, who will kind of illustrate a physical phenomena. I do love that music, but for me, that's just not what I want to do. I want to leave a trace of myself.
Well, exactly. And for me, there are so many people who are genuinely experimenting and working on process and really trying to say something academic with their work. And I don't begrudge that at all. There's definitely a place for it. And I hope that sort of material continues to be explored. I'm not the one to do it. So
sure,
I would rather step aside and let those who are truly invested in it experience that. I mean, I remember for me, one of the greatest eye-opening things I heard a few years ago was, are you familiar with Hans Kruse?
I'm not.
He's quite an amazing guy, a visual artist as well. I guess you could call him a musician, but a record was put out of his, very sad, low run, but it was essentially culled from just cassette tapes that he had, and the label just got bits and pieces and strung together a record. And it was so makeshift bricolage, and I was listening to somebody who definitely didn't care what I thought, and I just loved the liberation of that. So I still obsessively listen to that record, and I believe Hans Kruse only has the one record. If I'm wrong, I would desperately love somebody to correct me, but I think he's just got the one. And I just, everything about it just speaks to me. It's moments like that just make me think that, you know, it's really good to express yourself without caring what other people think of your expression.
I am like a super just emotional and sensitive person, and I've tried to distance myself from that for a long time, and I think like there's some sort of liberation in just making things for yourself, expressing yourself, and that's cool. I gotta hear that record.
Yeah, I'll link you to it.
Oh, great. Excellent. I'll put it in the notes for the listeners. Okay, so I would be upset if I did not mention Caduc Blues, because it's such a crazy film, and your music is so crazy and different from the Kai LP and the No Rant and the piece we just played. It shows your range as a musician. The first thing I want to kind of ask about is, do you think that empathy, like, to what's happening on the screen, is like a key component? Because I just recently worked on a film project, and I think that's like the one lesson I learned, was that you really have to be sensitive and empathize with what's happening on the screen. Although Caduc Blues is this like absurdist thing, you still have to, I mean, was it just like a disconnection, or did you truly empathize with what was happening on the screen?
No, I empathized totally. It was, I guess, a rather unique situation for me, because I'm very good friends with the director, Dave Jackson. And I had been involved with him in this film right from the very start. I remember him sending me a draft of the first script, which was going to be a short film used to try to raise money for the feature it became. So I'd always been a part of that film. I think I actually came up with the title as well. So I was always heavily invested, and for me, I wasn't just making a soundtrack, I was helping my friend, you know? And it was a really eye-opening experience. I wasn't given a lot of limitations, but obviously what I was doing had to very directly relate to something that I didn't create. And that in itself was a very interesting thing to do, because when I'm working on my other music, I don't have to worry about anything other than, you know, the direction I think it should go. But now all of a sudden I'm having to worry about visual cues and emotional response to a scene that I didn't write or direct. And it's interesting just falling into place as a cog in something bigger. But yeah, the empathy was there 100%, even during the most heinous scenes in that. And it's a pretty messed up film. Even during those moments, I'm still feeling a sense of empathy, because I don't know, I needed that in order to approach the music. And I was making a lot of what I was calling sketches. And Dave, the director, would sort of list different scenes that he had, and maybe if he had any ideas of the sort of music, and I would just play around and send back a whole bunch of 30-second sketches and said, does this sound right? Does this sound right? Does this sound right? And interestingly, most of the tracks that became final parts of the score were things that completely stepped away from the direction I was given. But if I hadn't been given the direction and tried to make those pieces adhering very specifically to it, I wouldn't have reached that point where I could move beyond it. And I don't know, I think it worked exactly as it was supposed to work.
I absolutely love the music in the film, and the film is just so much fun. Yeah, it's funny that we were talking about this kind of, you know, just doing it for yourself, not giving a shit. But then when you have to do something and being a cog in a bigger thing, you do have to please somebody else. It's sort of like going back to that thing, you know, we were saying about, oh, I want to make this thing for a CDR label. So how do you make that successful and be true to yourself when you are trying to literally please your friend?
Yeah, and that's a really tricky thing to balance, I'm not going to lie. There were things that I maybe stopped myself from doing because I was worried that it wasn't going to work for him. And I always regret moments like that. So that's being completely honest. But what I think helped me was the unwavering faith that he had in what I was going to do, and which is boggling in and of itself because I don't have experience scoring films. But he really did just give me as much freedom as I wanted, and he didn't micromanage in any means. There was only a couple of little tracks where he wanted very specific by the second cues. Otherwise, I was able just to do things the way I saw fit. And yeah, if it hadn't been for that trust that he placed, it would have been a much more difficult process for me. I felt, because he actually made me feel like my contribution was respected. And I guess for my own sense of self-worth, that was more important than I'd like to admit. And that helped. And I was able to deliver something that sort of strode that line between personal satisfaction and delivering the product.
In my opinion, the music and the just connecting the music to the film, it's so successful because it could be anything and everything. Like the opening scene with the credits is like this metal song, and it's so cool with the visuals. And then you've got these like more ambient moments with synths, and it shows a different side to your work, the versatility of your work. And I think that's really great that you were so trusted. I think it would have been a much more different thing if you guys weren't such close friends.
Absolutely, because he knew what I stood for before. There was no illusions that I listened to what one would call traditional music. And so he knew if I was going to do this, he was going to get something that might be a bit sort of nuts. And that's what he wanted. And I guess it does fit the film because the film is really nuts.
Yes.
But that opening title music that you were just talking about, that was a last minute addition. Originally there was a track that was like a frenetic sort of boredoms inspired Japanese piece, and it was good. And it was really chaotic and loud and noisy, and there was some licensing issues right toward the end when the distributor was preparing it for release. And so Dave didn't want to risk legal issues, obviously. So he came to me and said, would you feel comfortable making something along these lines? And yes, that was absolute joy to me. I made most of that in one night, and it was so much fun.
You should really see this movie, Caduc Blues. Like, it is so much fun. Matthew's music is just perfect for it. All right, Matt, I think we are going to wrap up. I think this has been a really fun conversation, and
absolutely.
Yeah. And I've personally, like, I learned so much from this conversation just about myself, and I want to learn, and I want to do that sort of thing. And honestly, you're so in touch with yourself and the creative process and what you need to do to express yourself that I relate very closely to it, and I want to thank you for that.
It's been a pleasure, and it goes without saying that if I do have any insight into myself, it's because of going through that exact same frustration you're talking about and wanting to push through it, and hoping too that there'll always be an element of frustration so that I never reach an end point, and I'm always trying to find out more, because it would be so fucking depressing if that weren't the case.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Matthew Revert. It was really, really interesting for me. I learned a lot about myself, and of course I learned a lot about Matthew. I had no idea that he was a musician before he was an author. It sort of makes a lot of sense. It was really illuminating to learn that, and learn about the circumstances of his second novel, and learn about his creative process, because honestly it's really close to what I was going for a long time. So personally, this was a very important episode for me. And I don't mean to mention myself too much, because we're here to learn about Matthew, but it was impossible not to, because it was such a important learning experience for me. Also, I want to note that I don't mean to get hung up on the phrase experimental music. I think I did at the beginning, and I was sort of surprised when Matthew was like, no, that's not me. And I'm glad that he said that, because it made me rethink what I've been doing for a long time. And it really does box you in by calling yourself something. It's amorphous. You should just do what you do, and what people want to call it, they'll call it. All right, before we go, I just want to mention that you can find us on the web at signifying-something.com. You could find these episodes on Bandcamp as well at signifyingsomething.bandcamp.com. And the reason I point that out is because you can download them as individual tracks. So you can get Matthew's borntwo piece separately as a separate file in whatever format you want. And I think that's cool, because you could just grab the piece and you can put it on anytime you want. Again, Matthew has LPs coming out on Kai and a tape coming out on No Rent soon. You could also subscribe to us on iTunes. Just look us up in the podcast directory and make sure you subscribe and rate. The ratings help us, so if you would like to rate us, I'd really appreciate it. We also have a Patreon page where you can help support the show financially. It's patreon.com, that's patreon.com/signifying something. You can follow us on Twitter at SignifyCast. You can email us, signifycast@gmail.com, signifycast@gmail.com. Or you could always check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/signifying something. We're going to try and do an episode every Wednesday, so check back, and we should have something for you next week.